Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the visual guide for Alphascape version 4.0 Savage, also known as O12S. In this guide, we're looking at the final encounter with Omega. Finally, my name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your raid guide. We begin the encounter with target analysis, which will place a blue marker over the head of one of the first 2 enmity targets. You can use an early provoke to ensure this only targets the tanks. Target analysis will first place a magic vulnerability up debuff on the player and anyone in their vicinity, before targeting them for a massive Savage Wave Cannon Tankbuster blast. The magic vulnerability debuff will cause the player to take lethal damage, unless the Tankbuster is shared with the other tank or they pop an immunity. To share the damage here, the debuff tank will need to stand behind the other tank while they both use cooldowns. Next up, Patch will tether the 4 damage dealers to a tank or a healer with either local regression or remote regression. These tethers will explode based on proximity, dealing a fair amount of raid damage and putting up 2 stacks of magic vulnerability up debuffs on the entire raid. These debuffs will last 2 seconds before they fall off. Local regression is a red and green tether that will explode if the players are too close together. Remote regression is a blue tether that will explode if players are too far apart. The group will need to avoid exploding more than 1 tether at a time, as the debuffs involved will quickly cause a wipe if you go too fast. These tethers will overlap with a number of the incoming mechanics, so before we go into the timing and order of each tether explosion, let's take a quick look at what's to come. Diffuse Wave Cannon is an attack that will deal damage in the front and back of the boss, or on both sides of the boss. Players can identify where the attack is coming from by looking at the animation of the cast. Specifically, the glowing orbs that appear in line with the boss's model or on its side. Where these glowing orbs appear will always be the safe side. Oversampled Wave Cannon will spawn a number of monitors on one side of the boss. 2 random players on the monitor side will be targeted by heavy-hitting circle AoE tankbusters. To handle this, the entire group will move to the opposite side of the boss, while the 2 tanks move into the monitor side, taking care not to be too close to one another. They'll need mild cooldowns to survive these tankbusters. Finally, Ion Efflux will deal massive raid-wide AoE damage. You'll need some pretty heavy mitigation and healing to survive this. If there are still patch tethers active during this time, you will die. All of these mechanics will be dealt with while members of the raid are still handling their patch tethers. Now that we know what to expect, we can break down the timing of everything. Now, the order that you delete the tethers is highly dependent on your group, so feel free to find out what works best for you. However, the timing of each tether pair explosion is roughly the same regardless of the order, so let's take a look at that. Patch goes out and all players are tethered. The player pairs will need to move appropriately to avoid setting off their tethers right away. The first tether pair will need to explode basically as soon as possible. Next, Diffuse Wave Cannon will begin to cast and the group will move to the safe sides, taking care not to accidentally explode any tethers. The second tether pair can explode as soon as the Diffuse Wave Cannon blast goes off. Next, the monitors will appear and the raid will rotate carefully to the opposite side, making sure they don't accidentally explode while both tanks take the tankbusters. Once the tankbuster damage goes off, the third tether pair can explode. This last tether pair timing can be tricky, as you want it to explode before the Ion Efflux cast goes off, but not too late that the group still has magic vulnerability up debuffs going into that cast. As the third pair explodes, the fourth pair will need to pay close attention to their debuffs, and as soon as that stack of magic vuln up falls off, they move to explode the last tether. This should roughly be happening around the start of the Ion Efflux cast, and this timing will allow the last set of debuffs to fall off right before the cast goes off. At this point, Omega will teleport to the center, face south, and begin to cast Hello World. This cast will do raid-wide damage and put up specific debuffs on specific players that will need to be resolved in a specific manner. Let's look at the possible debuffs first. Critical Overflow Bug is indicated by this red circle debuff and lasts 8 seconds before exploding in a massive circle AoE. This explosion deals high damage and afflicts anyone caught inside of it with the same Critical Overflow Bug debuff. Once a player's Critical Overflow Bug explodes, they are left with Overflow Debugger debuff, which prevents them from receiving another Critical Overflow Bug. This debuff will always target a random tank at the beginning of Hello World. Latent Defect is indicated by this blue DNA looking debuff and lasts 10 seconds before killing the player. To avoid death, Latent Defect must be cleansed by taking a single hit of damage. This will always affect the other tank, a healer, and 1 damage dealer at the beginning of Hello World. Critical Synchronization Bug is indicated by this red icon with a group of people inside of it. It targets 2 damage dealers at the beginning of Hello World. One damage dealer will have a 12-second duration, while the other one has an 8-second duration. At the end of the respective durations, the debuff will explode in a smaller AoE circle, dealing very high damage and replacing that debuff with a synchronization debugger debuff, which will prevent them from receiving another critical synchronization bug. This damage can be shared by 2 players, and any player in the blast zone without the initial critical sync bug or debugger debuff will be afflicted with another 8-second duration of critical synchronization bug. One healer and one damage dealer will also start Hello World without a single debuff. This can be one of the most confusing aspects of any encounter you've had to deal with so far, especially if you're brand new. So let's break it down really slow. Please keep in mind that there are multiple ways to handle positioning here and many variances to strats that all tout their own advantages. I'll only be going over one strat, but fundamentally understanding what each debuff does and how to resolve it will allow you to experiment and find out what works best for your group. We know that 3 players will instantly die if their latent defects are not immediately taken care of. To avoid death, they must take damage from a single source, and they'll use the first critical overflow bug explosion to handle this. Since the critical overflow bug explosions are insanely massive, we need to be very careful with our positioning here. The tank with critical overflow will move to the south side of the platform to ensure that their explosion isn't covering. All other players will move a bit north to handle their respective debuffs out of the way of these blasts. We're going to ignore these guys for now, but keep them in mind. As soon as the critical overflow bug explodes, the latent defect players will instead be afflicted by critical overflow bugs themselves. Again, since these explosions are massive and we now have 3 of them to deal with at the same time, positioning is again very important. We assign the east, south, and west cardinal points to the damage dealer, healer, and tank players affected by critical overflow. These players will need to stand on the edge of the platform on their cardinal points to avoid overlapping damage. Once their explosions go off, they'll move back towards the boss in the north. Let's rewind a little bit and see what's going on with the other debuffs. The 2 damage dealers afflicted by critical synchronization bugs need to stack with another person to survive the damage of their explosions. The damage dealer with the shortest duration will explode at the same time as the first critical overflow bug on the tank. They'll be stacking with the healer that currently has no debuffs to share the damage. The critical sync bug will then apply to that healer, and this pair will move together to the far north to share the last explosion out of the way of the next round of the massive critical overflow bug explosions. The damage dealer with a longer duration can wait until the first set of initial explosions happen before moving to the north wall as well. They will be sharing their explosion with a tank that was initially targeted by critical overflow before moving away. The tank can then take the next sync bug explosion by themselves with a cooldown. The damage dealer with no debuffs will wait for the second round of overflow bug explosions and get hit by 1 to receive the overflow bug themselves. They will move to their assigned spot in the east to explode. At this point, the boss will cast critical error, dealing mild raid-wide damage and afflicting any raid members without overflow debugger with another round of critical overflow bugs. With the way that everything was handled up to this point, this will cause 3 players to be afflicted with overflow bug. They will move to their assigned spots in the east, south, and west to explode, out of the way of the rest of the raid on the boss. Next, the boss will cast Ion Efflux, dealing high raid-wide damage. Be sure to cooldown, shield, and heal through this damage. At this point, the boss will teleport to the middle and begin to cast Archive Peripheral. This will cause 3 arm units to spawn on one side of the platform that will cast multiple large line AoE attacks all the way across the platform. You should also notice that each arm has an orange or blue arrow indicator, showing in which direction these line AoEs will turn with each blast. The pattern of arrows here will cause the formation of a single safe spot on the platform. Players will need to quickly identify the safe spot and move to it to avoid getting blasted by the lasers. While this is happening, the boss will cast another target analysis. The tanks will need to handle this away from the rest of the raid while also making sure they don't get clipped by the rotating AoE blasts. Next, another diffuse wave cannon and the raid will need to reposition into the safe spot around the boss. This is followed by another oversampled wave cannon, and the raid will again need to move to the safe side while the 2 tanks move to the monitor side to take the tank busters. Next, Omega will cast Index and Archive Peripheral. 3 arm units will spawn outside of the platform and tethered to 3 players. At the same time, Omega will begin to cast Wave Cannon. The tethered players will need to move directly across the platform to the opposite edge of their arm units. The free players will need to position themselves between the tethers and stay closer to the boss to bait Wave Cannon. Wave Cannon will target the closest players with line AoE attacks. The tethered players will also be hit with their own Hyperpulse line AoEs from each arm unit that deals proximity-based damage. Having the free players stand in between the tethered players will avoid overlap. These attacks deal a fair amount of damage, so healers be ready to top everyone off. This is followed by another target analysis. Don't forget those cooldowns cooldowns and heals. Since this happens fairly often throughout the fight, it's a good idea for tanks to always check their enmity levels and make sure they're number 1 and number 2 at all times. At this point, the boss will cast Patch again, and the incoming combo of mechanics is the exact same as the combo in the beginning. Remember to control the tether explosions in between the next diffused wave cannon, oversampled wave cannon, and before that ion efflux. Immediately after, Omega will cast Archive All, and a number of right and left arm units will spawn around the platform. These arms will begin to cast Colossal Blow and will explode for lethal damage. There is also a massive line AoE in the center with an orange or blue indicator that will slowly turn in the indicated direction with each blast. The boss will also cast Electric Slide here, leaping to the platform edge directly in front of him and dealing proximity-based damage. To handle all of this, the raid must first quickly identify which way the boss is facing and which of the arm units is in the safe zone based on the massive line AoE's direction. Once identified, the raid will move behind the safe arm unit and begin to destroy it as quickly as possible. The goal is to destroy this arm before Colossal Blow goes off, creating a safe spot for the raid to stand in. Furthermore, the boss will be casting Delta Attack during this time, which will place circle AoEs under players. 4 players will also be targeted for fire circle AoEs, and 1 player will be marked for a stack-up marker. All players will need to move out of the initial circle AoEs in a controlled manner to ensure no overlap of the meteor circles. Once the first set of initial circle AoEs go off, the stack-up marker will return to that same spot with everyone else available to share the damage. While dodging this combo of mechanics, players are still destroying the arm unit to create the safe zone that they'll use to dodge the rest of the arm unit explosions. At this point, the boss will cast another diffuse wave cannon, and the raid will reposition around him in a safe zone. Moments after, Omega will teleport into the center and cast another Hello World. Players will face all of the same debuffs that they saw in the first Hello World, only this time they'll have an extra critical Underflow Bug to handle. The old Hello World debuffs will apply to players in the same manner. Critical Underflow Bug will target the healer that does not get latent defect at the beginning of Hello World 2. It has a 15-second duration and will explode at 0, dealing lethal damage to anyone around the player. This debuff can be passed to any nearby players before the timer expires. A player that has passed Underflow Bug will gain the debuff Underflow Debugger and become immune to another pass. The second difference in this Hello World 2 mini-phase is the formation of 3 pillar AoEs across the center of the platform. Allowing these pillars to explode will wipe the group. Standing inside one of these pillars will affect the player with Cascading Latent Defect, a debuff that lasts 8 seconds and will kill the player if not cleansed properly. To cleanse this debuff, players that go into the pillars must have active critical Underflow Bug debuffs. Let's look at how we handle all of this. The tank with critical Overflow Bug will again move to the edge of the platform to explode in a relatively safe manner. The healer and damage dealer with latent defects will stand in this explosion to avoid death. The tank with latent defect can stack with the first short critical synchronization bug player to receive that debuff. After this same damage dealer will run to the longer critical sync bug player to share that explosion with them. The healer with Underflow will stand to the side, and once the first critical overflow tank explodes, that tank can run to the healer or be rescued by them to gain Underflow. The healer can then move away from others to explode safely. The damage dealer and healer that now have critical overflow will position themselves along the edge to avoid overlap. The damage dealer without a buff and the healer that just got rid of Underflow will stand in these explosions to gain critical overflow bugs themselves. During this time, the critical sync tank will explode on their own, taking the damage with appropriate cooldowns. At this point, the new damage dealer and healer with critical overflow will move to the same assigned spots to avoid overlapping their explosions. The light pillars will also spawn during this time. The tank with the active Underflow Bug will run into the stack players and the other tank to spread Underflow to all 3 of them, before moving away from the group to explode his debuff. During this time, Omega is casting Critical Error. This will cause the same players that currently have Underflow debuffs to be afflicted with Overflow debuffs. They will first move to their assigned pillar with their Underflow debuffs to ensure they resolve safely. As soon as the pillars are taken care of, these 3 players will continue to their assigned cardinal points to avoid overlapping their Overflow explosions. During this time, their Underflow debuffs will also fall off and explode safely away from others. This mini phase concludes with another Ion Efflux cast. Be sure to cool down, shield, and heal through this damage. This phase follows the exact same mechanic rotation as the phase directly after the first Hello World, all the way up until the second Hello World. If you've made it this far, it's just a matter of going through the same motions again. Once this phase is complete, instead of casting another Hello World, Omega will instead cast Program Omega, beginning the Soft Enrage phase. From this point on, Omega will spam Ion Efflux, gaining a damage up buff with every completed cast. The boss will You'll reach 5 stacks and then cast the final Ion Efflux Enrage. This encounter is all about maximizing your damage while handling the massive confusing debuffs in turn. It'll certainly take a lot of practice, so don't despair. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.